let's take a look at the box office from this past weekend. Total box office domestically, 213 million. Wowza, is a 105% jump. This is the biggest box office weekend domestically of the year so far. And I said this last week about Bad Boys. I was pessimistic about Bad Boys' box office potential, and my projections were much lower than what it ended up being. For Inside Out, I doubled down, and due to just the sluggish kind of post-COVID, post-strikes box office results, especially of 2024, and then especially looking at like Pixar's success over the past couple of years, I was very bearish about it, and I was projecting Inside Out to make about 61 to 68 million for the weekend. It is the most successful movie of the year so far, and it is, I think I read, the second highest opening for an animated film ever. And not only did it exceed my expectations, it exceeded even the people who were saying, the most projections were putting it anywhere from 70 even up to 100 million. It is made, coming in at number one, grossed 155 million, more than doubling my highest projection. I'm more than happy to say when I'm wrong. I am an Inside Out hater. Well, I don't really hate it. I find it okay, and it's more annoying how everyone talks about how great it is. And this film looks like it's doubled down on all of the original's worst qualities. So I was very pessimistic about this, but, this is definitely a win for Disney, and especially Pixar. A win in the sense of the financial sense, because I know both we knew from like insiders, but then also just they've been very explicit. Like the success or failure of this movie was really going to determine a lot about Pixar's trajectory, right? This was made off of a $200 million budget, and it's already made $295 million worldwide. So again, it is already the biggest opening of the year, and I still have yet to see it. It's been getting seemingly decent reviews. I wouldn't say it's mixed. It seems mostly positive, if not very, very positive, but I have seen some fairly negative reviews. I will probably be more on the meh side, but, if audiences really like it, then this could be, it could really have some legs. But if it doesn't have some legs, then, and it has a big drop-off, that's a whole other conversation. But this could very well be the most successful film of the year, or maybe at least in like the top 2 or 3. Now, I will say, though, that this is a little concerning, because I've actually done a video about Pixar and like their kind of situation. Highly recommend you go check out that video. But the video is basically about how Pixar seems to be the business strategy before this movie came out. The business strategy was already going to shift towards really focusing on their existing intellectual property, which I always find very stupid for studios, just because ultimately every sequel, like everything, if you're like, oh, this proved successful before, those were all original ideas at some point, right? So eventually you have to kind of like freshen up the pot and like come up with new things, right? But I remember they were talking about, people at Pixar being like, oh, the past like couple of years we've really focused on more personal-ish films, more kind of experimental, and not experimental formally, but just experimental as in like they're not based on anything, they're more kind of low-key narratives and storylines and characters, and they have felt that wasn't very successful, which I feel like isn't fair, seeing as half of their output has just been on Disney Plus, and one of their few films that they have released theatrically over the past couple of years, Lightyear, was based off of an IP, but it bombed. It seems like the lesson they've taken is that, the issue wasn't that was a sequel, reboot, spin-off. The issue was that it wasn't similar enough to the original thing. It was too much of a departure. So this is really disappointing, right? Not so much that this film is doing well, but rather what are the lessons that are going to be taken from this. And I think Hollywood, with some rare exceptions, Hollywood and movie studios always take the wrong lessons from success or failure. And I think the lesson here is going to be, shit, fuck things like Turning Red, fuck things like Soul, fuck things like Luca and all these other more, more personal films, which often are from underrepresented communities, like Turning Red especially, right? Instead of doing that shit, let's make Incredibles, not even Incredibles 3, but they're talking about rebooting The Incredibles, rebooting Finding Nemo, right? Like, it just baffles me. So this is very good. I'm happy about this because it shows that there's some health left in the American box office. I think this film, I don't know if this is solely because of Inside Out 2 or just American audiences were just waiting for something that they could kind of just, not to be gross, like blow their load on, right? Like just it was building up this desire to go back to the movies, right? And just in these huge droves and just there hadn't been quite the movie to do that yet. That could kind of unite all the different movie-going communities. And I think this just happened to be the right movie in the right place, right? So all this pessimism aside, it is good to see that a film can still open, not only more than 100 million, but 155. That I was shocked when I read that, because again, even the most optimistic projections were putting at like 100 million. So that's definitely something interesting to kind of keep an eye on as it moves into its second, third, fourth week. Looking at films continuing this weekend, we have at number 2, the fourth Bad Boys film, which premiered last week, Bad Boys Ride or Die, bringing in about 33 million, dropped from first to second, of course, which makes sense in its second frame. Only a 42% drop, though, so not awful by any stretch of the imagination, and especially considering what replaced it in the top spot. It had a lot to kind of work against here, but it also probably helped that it was kind of semi-counter programming, right? Those audiences aren't necessarily going to overlap, right? This brings its domestic total to 112 million for 112 million domestically and 215 million worldwide off of just $100 million budget. So if you believe the idea that you need to basically double the budget to kind of break even, when you incorporate all of like the marketing and advertising costs, which aren't part of the budget, this, by that metric, this has met that, right? So, this film has definitely been a success for them. Also continuing this weekend, number 5, going into its second weekend, at number 5, The Watchers, the Ishana Shyamalan, the daughter of M. Night Shyamalan, who went to NYU with me. The Watchers at 3.7 million. This has not gotten very good reviews, so it didn't open very high to begin with. It was at 4th, and now it's dropped to 5th. And this had a 48% drop, which is also, again, not awful, but definitely not what you want to be seeing, especially since it didn't make a huge amount in its first weekend to begin with. This brings its domestic total to about 14 million. And then it's worldwide total to 23. I wasn't able to find what the budget was for this, but again, I would imagine this is pretty cheap. That's kind of Shyamalan's thing, is that it's very much high concept, not super VFX heavy. Oftentimes taking place like in one location or just a few locations. So I would imagine that this film, if it could kind of have a little bit of legs and kind of maybe cross like 30 or 40 million worldwide, it might end up being a success financially, but who's to say? Other things continuing. So this is really interesting. So Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes coming in at number 3, bringing in 5.2 million for the weekend, jumping from 5th to 3rd place in its 6th frame. This thing's been out for over a month. We're getting into the heavy season. And it's still not only in the top 5, but actually kind of rose back up through the ranks. And only had a 4% drop from last weekend. That's insane. That is, and I'm very interested to find out like what's the reason for that. And I don't know if we ever quite will. This brings its domestic total to 158 million and 375 million worldwide off of just a $160 million budget. So again, this is doubled its budget. This is turning into a pretty decent little success for the Planet of the Apes franchise, which has always been very successful. It's one of those franchises that never was huge, but always did pretty well, which in modern Hollywood, they don't give a shit about that anymore. They just want to have the huge returns. But this is has always been a solid moneymaker. So it's very interesting to see that not only did it only have a 4% drop, but it actually jumped up in the rankings. Also, in the top 5, we still have the Garfield movie at number 4, bringing in $5 million. This, unlike Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, this dropped from 2nd to 4th in its 4th frame now. This was a 50% drop. So again, not awful. This has made most of the money that it's gonna make. I don't see this having huge staying power, especially now that Inside Out 2 is in theaters. Like, Garfield movie, I think, was the appetizer for families and children, and now, it's onto the main course, right? This brings its domestic total to $79 million and worldwide total to $218 million, off of just a $60 million budget. So this has been very successful, which again sets a bad precedent, because from all estimations, I have not seen this. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just kind of mediocre, just kind of exactly what you would expect from the Garfield animated movie in 2024. Just a couple notes here. Films still in the top 10. We have If, again, also a surprise. At number 6, $3.5 million for the weekend, dropped from 3rd to 6th, and so it dropped out of the top 5. Pretty substantial drop, 56%. But this brings its domestic total to $101 million and $174 million worldwide, off of a $110 million budget. So again, it hasn't quite doubled the budget, but this is something I've been talking about week after week. So I don't want to belabor it too much, but this idea that Hollywood is reverting back to an older period where films didn't make as much in their opening weekend, but had much stronger legs and staying power. And I think this is an example of that. This film that, again, kind of like Garfield movie, like by all accounts was kind of just like meh, like no one really gave a shit about it one way or the other. And it's still in the top 10 after 5 weeks. Another example of that, which I will champion, is The Fall Guy at number 8, bringing in just a $1.5 million for the weekend. This is not a movie I thought was great, but I thought it was really good, and it was unfairly kind of like, this is a huge bomb for the summer season's off to a horrible start, this, that, the other, right? But it's still in the top 10. In its 7th frame, it dropped from 7th to 8th place this weekend. Only a 42% drop, though. It's brought in about $88 million domestically and $170 million worldwide, off of a $150 million budget. So, again, it has not been financially successful by any stretch of the imagination. But the fact that it's still holding, especially since they panicked and released it on digital like 2 weeks after it opened, the fact it's still in the top 10, I think, again, speaks to kind of that thesis of mine, that films need to kind of have a more of a marathon approach as opposed to a sprint. Also still in the top 10, we have at number 9, The Strangers, Chapter 1, bringing in just a paltry $760,000. This is another example. It actually jumped from 10th to 9th place in its 5th frame, but pretty big drop though, 58%. This brings it to $34 million domestically, $40 million worldwide, but off of just an $8.5 million budget. Again, this is an example of why Hollywood loves horror films, because they're cheap and they oftentimes can bring in a not always a huge amount, though that can happen, but even if it just brings in a decent amount, because it was made for so cheap, it's a pretty good return on investment. And then we also have the Lord of the Rings. So they re-released the Lord of the Rings in theaters, and I guess it's still in theaters. So the first one still is in the top 10. But it's very interesting to kind of see. I've been saying the summer season started like the last weekend of April, because that's what it used to be pre-COVID. Like, I remember the Avengers kind of set that, where I remember famously it was Infinity War was gonna premiere the first weekend of May, and then like last second they were like, JK, we're actually going to do it the last weekend of April. And it kind of felt like this is now the beginning of the summer movie season. So I feel like we've been saying now we're really starting. This really does feel like the beginning of the summer season, even though we're already like halfway through June, and arguably the summer movie season kind of ends at the end of July, because August is often really dead. It doesn't make a lot of money, and there's not a lot of huge movies coming out. But in any case, it seems like Inside Out 2 has kind of given the Suits a huge sigh of relief. But the question, again, that I bring up, and I'm not trying to be pessimistic, is, what's going to be the lesson taken from all of this? And I don't think it's going to be the right lesson.